have you now.
Hello, it's Ryan from SW Squad Up, and welcome back to another video. Today we'll be discussing one of the most desired and one of my favorite Star Wars ships that has been currently left out of Squadrons, the B-Wing. There is concept art of the B-Wing blueprints among ships in the game, suggesting it may have been considered to be in the game at some point, but it didn't make the final lineup. Many people believe that it's only a matter of time before the B-Wing gets added into Squadrons in DLC, but let me remind everyone first. Ian Fraser has already stated that there are no current plans for DLC for Squadrons. Motive Studios wants to create Squadrons with the old-fashioned feel of a complete game at launch. There are no plans for DLC or future content for Squadrons right now. Personally, I'd imagine if the sales of the game blow the projections out of the water, then there's a bigger chance for some amount of DLC in the future. But I'm sticking with the mindset that is not going to happen, so I don't have too high of expectations for it. With that out of the way, let's get into why the B-Wing isn't in Squadrons. What complications, difficulties, and design balance issues did Motive potentially run into that kept the B-Wing out of the game? I've come to the general conclusion that there are three main points that could be the reasons why we cannot have our B-Wing. First, representing the B-Wing's unique movement in-game that's only in first person and not making it a nightmare for players to fly. Second, visual cockpit additions for the desired representation needed for no HUD mode in Squadrons, along with the likely additional controls for players to input on gamepads, keyboard and mouse, or HOTAS setups. And finally, the need for a matching Imperial counterpart to the B-Wing. Canonically, the B-Wing's cockpit pod at its head has a gyroscopic stabilization system which keeps it stationary at a set level horizon while the rest of the starfighter rotates around it. It allowed pilots to better concentrate on flying and targeting enemy ships while minimizing G-stresses the pilot felt while performing evasive maneuvers. While this makes it sound easier to fly from a first-person perspective since it'll stay even, there are two complications with that. First is that it could actually be kind of boring to always fly if you are always viewing everything from the same level unless you pitch up or down. You'll never feel like you're doing a barrel roll or get the same satisfaction of doing complex maneuvers. Then there's the rest of the ship's body, which is nowhere near the first-person view. If we look at every other ship currently in Squadrons, the cockpits are mostly within the center mass of the ship with a slight left side skew for the support ships since they have unused co-pilot seats, and a slight right side skew for the TIE bomber with its two pods. The B-Wing cockpit, on the other hand, is way off from the ship's center. So flying from a first-person perspective presents a problem for the players being able to know where the rest of the ship is around it from the gyroscopic stabilization mentioned before. This is a big issue for knowing if you're going to collide with obstacles, structures, or other ships with the rest of your chassis. Which leads into my second main point that involves helping solve those problems, but can overcomplicate controls that may not work with the console or gamepad using player base. This potentially adds another layer of information that needs to be given to the players within their cockpit, which could be a bit of information overload. If you give players manual control of where the rest of the B-Wing body is located around the cockpit, that has to be able to be mapped onto a gamepad controller like the Xbox or PlayStation ones. Everything looks pretty taken up on the controllers already if we look at an image taken from the default controls that became public after the EA Game Changers gameplay. Although, recalling back to the gyroscopic stabilization system, the B-Wing from the first-person perspective doesn't roll, so the roll control could just become how you control where the body is around the cockpit. If for any reason changing the roll on the B-Wing to controlling the body position around the cockpit doesn't work well, then there's almost nowhere else to put that control on gamepads. Which is important for Motive to make sure that this game retains its ability to be played by a wide audience, especially if this treatment would only be for this one ship. Now, how do you solve telling the players piloting the B-Wing where the body is positioned from within the cockpit only? Currently, we have the ship status indicator that is set to show us our ship's health and shields if they have them. On the New Republic side, those indicators have all been circular, where you'll see a silhouette of the ship until the hull starts to take damage, then it will display the ship's remaining hull value numerically. Maybe they just implement an arrow indicator that spins around or within the ship status indicator to show the pilot where the body is pointed from the cockpit. This needs to be easily recognizable and readable, as knowing where the rest of the B-Wing chassis is located is a big deal for pilots and might conflict with the already established UI cockpit design. Even though that solution has potential, there is the need to balance how fast the body can and should rotate around the cockpit, both for canonical and gameplay balancing. The developers will need to make sure you can't just spin it too fast to cause targeting issues for enemy ships going after the B-Wings, plus it just looked very funky spinning it too fast, and that it's not too slow, which would make it frustrating for pilots to roll the body around in time to avoid collisions. This is all to make sure players can fly just this one ship without having issues colliding too often, since the first-person cockpit location is at the end of the ship, instead of its center mass like other starfighters in the game, all while maintaining as authentic an experience as possible. It's a daunting task, and while there are some solutions that can help, there's still one more pain point: what would the Imperial counterpart be? There isn't any ship just like it on the Imperial side, especially how it would control. Nothing really matches its profile of speed, firepower, durability, and/or design intent. Whatever class would be created between the B-Wing and an Imperial counterpart would have to be the first class with the largest difference in firepower, speed, and toughness between the two factions within its own class, which can lead to some difficult balancing in-game. Let's entertain for a bit what might fit as the best counterpart for the B-Wing and what class that could create. It has to be an Imperial starfighter that's recognizable to a wider audience, a ship that's Disney canon, and could join the lineup of already iconic ships we see in a large amount of Star Wars media. On top of all that, it does have to share some traits that the B-Wing has as well. I believe that ship is the TIE Defender, and together they would create the Assault class in Squadrons. Assault class being designed for all-out assaults on their enemy starfighters and large ships with a wide array of weaponry at their disposal. The difference between the B-Wing and the TIE Defender is how they deliver that heavy armament. Now, how does the Assault class carve a role into Squadrons without overlapping with others too much, making something obsolete? Focusing on the phrase all-out assaults, maybe you take the countermeasures component off the B-Wing and TIE Defender and change it to a secondary laser cannon. That way, the trait of the B-Wing and TIE Defender being equipped with multiple types of laser cannons can translate to in-game play. Instead of equipping a countermeasure, you choose another type of cannon as a secondary cannon component. The normal input to launch a countermeasure on your controls changes to swapping back and forth between laser cannon types that have its own cooldown before you can swap again. To counteract the lack of countermeasures on these ships, this is where the B-Wing and TIE Defender divert on how they work. Their speed is the largest difference between these two ships, and the TIE Defenders would need to use that to evade incoming locked fire. The B-Wing's defense would just be its overall toughness being the highest among all ships to just weather the storm against it. But Ryan, wouldn't the TIE Defender just outspeed the B-Wing counterpart, you may say? To that, it could be set up that the TIE Defender, while it has a higher speed, it ends up having a worse turn radius, while the B-Wing being slower has a tighter turn radius. The TIE Defender being better for fast, sweeping passes, while the B-Wing is steady, staying on target. What about having all that firepower, which would just make it better than the Bomber class, right? Well, for one, the Assault class wouldn't have bombs and some of the heavier torpedoes and missiles the Bomber class does. The idea would be versatile firepower with its wide array of weapon types. Then, how would this not make the fighter class obsolete? Well, the fighters still have their countermeasures for one, but also the X-Wing has superior speed and maneuverability in comparison to the B-Wing. For the TIE Fighter versus TIE Defender, the fighter will still be a better knife fighter than the TIE Defender from the better turn radius, and while the TIE Defender has shields, it then loses its more efficient power management system like the other TIE ships have that don't have shields, while transferring power back and forth from engines to lasers is faster. What I'm suggesting is by no means foolproof, but there are potential gameplay solutions to the problem of what would be the B-Wing's Imperial counterpart. It's still a difficult challenge that during development may have caused too many issues rather than solved them for the Squadrons experience overall. We know Motive wants to create one of the most authentic and tightest Star Wars piloting experiences, and adding a fifth class, including the B-Wing, might have been too difficult to accomplish with what the developers have envisioned for Squadrons. There's probably even more things that I haven't mentioned that were issues that presented themselves with adding in the B-Wing, but we just don't know because we aren't part of Motive Studios. Although, if the sales skyrocket, if the demand is there from the players, and if Motive can solve everything that would need to be solved to add in a fifth class that includes the B-Wing, we may see it in the future. Ian Fraser has described Motive being full of big Star Wars fans, and I assume as much as we want more ships like the B-Wing to be in Squadrons, they do too. Until we get news in the far future that entertains this desired addition, we'll close the case on the B-Wing for now. Let me know your thoughts on this subject, and if you have another idea of an Imperial counterpart to a B-Wing, post it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell icon to get notified when new videos go live. And I'll see you in the next Squad Up video.